What if the most powerful emperor on earth could command armies, appoint patriarchs, and define the very boundaries of his realm, but could not force a single monk to abandon a painted image? Picture this. The year is 726, and the Aegean Sea is boiling, not metaphorically. An underwater volcano has erupted with such violence that entire coastal communities have vanished beneath waves and ash. Ships that sailed these waters for generations now navigate through floating pumice and the debris of destroyed villages. The smell of sulfur hangs heavy in the air for weeks, drifting across the waters toward Constantinople itself. Fishermen who have worked these shores all their lives cannot recognize the coastline anymore. Islands have been reshaped by fire and fury from beneath the sea. In the imperial palace, Emperor Leo III watches the reports arrive. Messengers bring news of fishing villages erased from maps. Tax collectors report croplands ruined by ashfall, their careful ledgers now recording nothing but devastation. Refugees stream into the capital, their faces gray with volcanic dust, their stories filled with terror. The smell of smoke and fear clings to everything. And Leo III sees something the scientists of his era cannot explain: divine judgment. God, the emperor concludes, is punishing his people. But for what sin? Leo III believes he knows the answer. He has seen it in the churches, in the markets, in the homes of his subjects. Everywhere he looks, Christians bow before painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and countless saints. They kiss these icons with fervent devotion. They light candles before them until the heat shimmers in the air. They weep and pray to wood and pigment as if the images themselves possess divine power. They attribute miracles to specific paintings, traveling great distances to seek their blessing. They carry small icons into battle, believing painted faces will protect them from arrows and swords. To Leo III, this looks exactly like the paganism his Christian empire supposedly rejected centuries ago. The Old Testament's second commandment could not be clearer: "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image." Yet his subjects had filled their world with exactly that. Icons covered the walls of churches from floor to ceiling. They hung in marketplaces where merchants bargained over grain and silk. They adorned city gates where travelers entered hoping for blessing on their journeys. They occupied places of honor in private homes where families gathered before them daily for morning and evening prayers. The volcano, Leo III decides, is God's answer to this idolatry. The fire and ash are divine messages written in destruction. The deaths of innocents are the price of collective sin. What followed would tear the Byzantine Empire apart for 117 years. Emperors would burn priceless artwork accumulated over centuries of careful craftsmanship. Monks would be tortured in public spectacles designed to humiliate them before crowds of thousands who had once venerated them as holy men. Refugees by the thousands would flee their homeland rather than abandon their icons, carrying what sacred images they could save across dangerous seas to uncertain futures. Theological debates that seem abstract today would translate into land confiscation, execution, and the permanent splitting of Eastern and Western Christianity. And at the center of it all stood a question that echoes into our own age. Who decides what images mean? And who has the power to destroy them? The Byzantine emperors who launched the Iconoclasm wars believed they were purifying Christianity, burning away corruption that had accumulated over centuries of careless practice. They commanded the most sophisticated military machine in the medieval world, controlled a bureaucracy that reached into every village with tax collectors and magistrates, and claimed divine authority to define religious doctrine itself. The title they bore, Pontifex Maximus, meant chief priest. Caesar and God's representative fused into a single sacred office. They appointed patriarchs with a word, They convened church councils at their pleasure. They issued theological edicts with the same authority they used to command armies into battle. But here is what they discovered. You can order an army to march, but you cannot order a soul to believe. To understand why images provoked such violence, you need to understand what icons meant to ordinary Byzantines. These were not decorations chosen for aesthetic pleasure. They were not art in the modern sense of visual objects created to beautify spaces. Byzantine Christians believed icons served as channels through which superhuman power descended to humanity. The icon was a window between worlds, a point of contact between the divine realm and the earthly one. Standing before an icon was standing at a threshold between heaven and earth. When a woman prayed before an image of the Virgin Mary, her knees aching on the cold stone floor of a candlelit church, she was not admiring craftsmanship or appreciating artistic technique. She believed the Virgin herself was present in some mysterious way, hearing her prayers through that specific image. When a soldier carried a small icon into battle, tucked into his armor or hanging from his neck on a cord worn thin by constant touching, he believed it offered genuine protection against enemy weapons. When a merchant displayed an icon in his shop, its golden surface catching the morning light, he trusted it would bring divine blessing to his business dealings. When a mother placed a small icon by her sick child's bed, she prayed with absolute certainty that the saint depicted could intercede for healing. This was not ignorance or superstition in the pejorative modern sense. Byzantine theology had developed sophisticated justifications for icon veneration over centuries of careful argument. The key argument rested on the incarnation itself, the central claim of Christianity that God became human in Jesus Christ. If God could become human flesh and blood, walking dusty roads and eating ordinary food, then matter itself was sanctified. Physical things could legitimately represent divine realities. An icon was not identical to the saint it depicted, but it participated in that saint's holiness in a real and meaningful way. The honor shown to an image passed through it to the person it represented, just as honoring a portrait of the emperor honored the emperor himself. Think about what this meant for everyday Byzantine life. Icons appeared everywhere in society. Churches displayed them prominently, of course, with special icons becoming famous for miraculous healings or answered prayers, drawing pilgrims from across the empire. But icons also decorated public buildings where officials conducted imperial business under their watchful eyes. They adorned city gates, blessing all who entered and departed. They occupied places of honor in private homes, where families gathered before them for daily prayers that structured the rhythm of each day. Merchants displayed icons in their shops alongside their wares. Ships carried protective images on their prows through dangerous waters. Soldiers brought icons on campaign, believing divine protection marched with them. The empire was saturated with sacred images in a way that is genuinely difficult for modern secular societies to fully grasp or appreciate. Now imagine being Emperor Leo III, watching your empire suffer a devastating natural disaster, and becoming convinced that all of this was idolatry that God himself was punishing with fire and ash. Leo III did not move immediately against the icons. He was too shrewd and experienced a political operator for that. He spent 4 years building support for what he understood would be an extraordinarily controversial policy. He consulted quietly with bishops who shared his theological concerns about image veneration, testing their willingness to support imperial action. He identified which military commanders would back him and which might resist or require persuasion. He tested the waters with smaller actions, gauging reactions and adjusting his approach accordingly. He was not a fool. He knew that attacking something so deeply embedded in Byzantine culture, so woven into the fabric of daily religious life, would require careful preparation and overwhelming force. There was another influence shaping Leo III's thinking, one that historians continue to debate. The Islamic prohibition on religious images had proven extraordinarily successful in building a dynamic, expansionist civilization. Muslim armies had conquered vast territories in the century before Leo III's reign, sweeping through lands that had been Christian for generations. The caliphate stretched from Spain to Persia, united under a faith that absolutely forbade religious images. Could their rejection of icons explain their victories? Was God rewarding their iconoclastic purity? Leo III, who had grown up on the empire's eastern frontier and understood Islamic culture better than most Byzantine emperors, may have drawn uncomfortable conclusions from these observations. In 730, Leo III made his decisive move. He ordered the removal of a famous image of Christ from the Chalky Gate, the main ceremonial entrance to the imperial palace. This was not some obscure church decoration tucked away where few would notice its absence. This was one of the most prominent religious images in Constantinople, visible to thousands of people daily as they passed through the heart of imperial power. The message was unmistakable. The emperor himself was declaring war on icons. The reaction was immediate and violent. A group of women attacked the soldiers removing the image, screaming with rage that these men dared touch the face of Christ. Riots broke out in the streets of Constantinople. Leo III had expected resistance, certainly, but the intensity may have surprised even him. What he discovered in those chaotic days was that touching these images triggered something primal in his subjects. They were not simply arguing about theological abstractions or debating the finer points of Christian doctrine in calm academic discourse. They were defending objects they genuinely believed connected them to divine protection. Take away an icon, and you were taking away their link to heaven itself. But Leo III was emperor. He had armies sworn to obey his commands. He had bureaucrats who could enforce his will in every corner of the empire. He also had one other crucial advantage. Patriarch Germanos I, the head of the Orthodox Church, who opposed iconoclasm, either resigned under pressure or was forced from office. The historical sources preserve some ambiguity about whether he left voluntarily or was pushed, but the result was the same. Leo III appointed a more compliant patriarch. The machinery of church and state aligned behind the new policy. At a council called the Silentium in 730, Leo III formally prohibited icon use throughout the Byzantine Empire. What had been central to Christian worship for centuries was now illegal. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to have something you deeply believe in suddenly declared criminal? Imagine waking up one morning to learn that the religious practices your family has followed for generations, the prayers your mother taught you, the rituals that marked every significant moment of your life from birth to marriage to death, are now crimes against the state. That is what millions of Byzantines experienced when iconoclasm became imperial policy. But the initial iconoclasm under Leo III, while significant, was relatively restrained compared to what came next. Leo III had started a fire. His son would turn it into an inferno that consumed everything it touched. Leo III died in 741. His son Constantine V took the throne, and he would prove far more zealous than his father in pursuing the war against images. Where Leo III had removed icons and prohibited their production, Constantine V launched what can only be described as a total cultural war against images and everyone who defended them. Constantine V was not merely a religious fanatic consumed by theological obsession. He was also an extraordinarily successful military commander, perhaps the most effective Byzantine general of his century. In 740, his forces won a decisive victory against Arab armies at Acroenos, turning back a major threat to the empire's eastern frontier. over the following decades. He conducted 9 successful campaigns against the Bulgars to the north, expanding Byzantine territory and demonstrating military prowess that few emperors could match. His subjects knew him as a warrior emperor who kept enemies at bay and brought glory to Byzantine arms. This military success proved crucial to iconoclasm's survival and intensification. When Constantine V destroyed icons, he could point to his battlefield victories as evidence of divine favor. God was clearly blessing an empire that had abandoned idolatrous images. The correlation seemed obvious to medieval minds accustomed to seeing divine while operating in earthly events. Iconoclast emperor wins battles. Therefore, iconoclasm must be the correct policy that pleases God. After his death, Byzantine sources record that common people would stand by Constantine V's tomb, seeking his aid as if he were a saint. The irony was profound. An emperor who had destroyed images of saints was himself becoming an object of quasi-religious veneration. But Constantine V wanted more than mere policy compliance from his subjects. He wanted theological victory, total ideological triumph over those who defended icons. In 754, he convened a church council that officially declared icons to be the work of the devil. This council notably lacked representation from the Pope or the Eastern Patriarchs, making its authority questionable even by Byzantine standards of ecclesiastical legitimacy. But Constantine V did not particularly care about such theological niceties. He had the army and the bureaucracy. He had won battles. That was authority enough for a man who believed God spoke through military victory. What followed was a systematic assault on Byzantine monasticism that would reshape the religious landscape of the empire for generations. Why target monasteries specifically? Because monks were the primary producers of icons and their most passionate defenders. Monasteries housed the scriptoriums where icons were painted by masters who had devoted decades to their craft. They maintained the schools where the theology of images was taught to each new generation. Monks had devoted their entire lives to creating sacred images and teaching others to venerate them properly. They would not simply abandon centuries of tradition and practice because an emperor demanded it. Their resistance was predictable, and Constantine V prepared accordingly. His solution was institutional destruction on a comprehensive scale. Picture what happened next. Monasteries that had stood for generations, some founded by saints whose names were revered throughout the Christian world, were seized by imperial officials who arrived with soldiers and legal documents. Monks were given a stark choice. Abandon your vows, your icons, and your way of life, or face punishment. Many chose punishment. Byzantine authorities, apparently unlimited in their cruelty, invented humiliations specifically designed to break monastic resistance. In one infamous spectacle that sources describe with horror centuries later, monks were forced to march through the Hippodrome, Constantinople's great arena where chariot races and public events drew crowds of tens of thousands. The monks were made to hold women's hands as they walked through that massive space, jeering crowds surrounding them on every side. For celibate monks who had devoted their entire lives to separation from worldly temptations, who had renounced marriage and sexuality as part of their religious commitment. This public degradation before jeering crowds was psychologically devastating. The humiliation was deliberately calculated to strike at the very heart of monastic identity. But the persecution extended far beyond public humiliation. Monastic lands were confiscated wholesale and converted to military purposes. Monasteries that had housed contemplative communities for centuries became barracks for soldiers. Monks were forced to wear secular clothing, stripping them of the habits that marked their religious identity. Some were pressured to marry, abandoning their vows of celibacy entirely. The institutional infrastructure of Byzantine monasticism, carefully built over centuries, faced systematic dismantlement at the hands of an emperor who saw monks as obstacles to his theological vision. Saint Stephen the Younger became the most famous martyr of this persecution. Refusing to abandon icon veneration, he was tortured and executed, his death demonstrating that Constantine would accept nothing less than complete submission to his theological vision. Consider what this meant in concrete human terms. A monk who had spent decades copying sacred texts in beautiful calligraphy, who had painted icons using techniques passed down through generations of masters, who had devoted his life to prayer and contemplation in a community of like-minded believers, suddenly found that community dissolved by imperial decree. His brothers were scattered, exiled, or forced into secular life. His life's work was declared criminal. The icons he had painted with such devotion were thrown into fires or smashed by soldiers following orders. The artistic losses were staggering and permanent. Centuries of accumulated religious art were destroyed in a matter of years. Church mosaics depicting Christ and the saints were stripped from walls and replaced with secular imagery, often simple crosses or decorative patterns. Portable icons were burned by the thousands. Illuminated manuscripts were destroyed. Art historians estimate that the vast majority of Byzantine religious art from before the Iconoclast period was permanently lost, leaving enormous gaps in our understanding of early Byzantine artistic development. Thousands of monks fled the empire rather than submit or suffer. Cyprus, southern Italy, Sicily became refuges for monks escaping iconoclast persecution. They carried what icons they could save, along with manuscripts, artistic techniques, and theological knowledge. The Byzantine Empire was hemorrhaging some of its most educated and devoted citizens, driving them into the arms of regions that would later challenge Byzantine cultural and political dominance. Yet despite everything, despite the torture and humiliation and exile and destruction, the resistance continued. Why did it continue? What made these monks willing to suffer rather than simply comply with imperial decrees? One of the most remarkable aspects of the iconoclasm controversy was the theological defense mounted against imperial power. The greatest defender of icons, John of Damascus, wrote his treatises from outside Byzantine territory, in Muslim-controlled lands where the Byzantine emperor's soldiers could not reach him. The irony was considerable. A Christian theologian finding refuge in Islamic lands to defend Christian images against a Christian emperor. From this position of safety, John of Damascus articulated arguments that would ultimately triumph over 3 iconoclast emperors. John of Damascus turned incarnation theology back against the iconoclasts with devastating logical precision. If Christ truly became human, he argued, taking on material flesh and blood, then he could legitimately be depicted in human form. The image was not identical to the divine essence it represented, but it participated in that reality in a meaningful way. Icons were imitations, representations, not idols demanding worship as if they were themselves divine beings. Venerating an icon was fundamentally different from worshiping an idol, because the honor passed through the image to the person it depicted, just as honoring a portrait of the emperor honored the emperor himself. This distinction between veneration and worship would prove theologically decisive. The Greek terms articulated a crucial difference. Proskynesis meant reverence, the kind of respectful honor one might show to a holy person or sacred object, while latreia meant worship, the adoration due to God alone. You could bow before an icon without worshiping it, just as you might bow before an emperor without believing he was divine. The iconoclasts either could not or would not acknowledge this distinction, but it would eventually win the theological argument. Meanwhile, the political consequences of iconoclasm were spreading far beyond the borders of theological debate. In 731, just 1 year after Leo III formally banned icons. Pope Gregory III in Rome publicly condemned iconoclasm. The Western Church would not accept a Byzantine emperor's authority to define religious doctrine. This was not merely a theological dispute over the status of images. It represented a fundamental disagreement about the nature of Christian authority itself. Byzantine emperors believed they possessed religious as well as political sovereignty, that their God-given role included guiding the Church in matters of doctrine. Roman popes increasingly and emphatically rejected this claim. The emperor ruled bodies. The pope, they argued, ruled souls. The consequences of this disagreement would reshape European history in ways still visible today. When Lombard invaders captured Ravenna in 751, the Byzantine Empire lost its main foothold in Italy and its ability to protect the papacy from hostile forces. The Pope, unable to rely on Constantinople for military protection while simultaneously rejecting Constantinople's religious authority, turned instead to the Franks. This fateful alliance, forged in the crucible of iconoclasm's consequences, would lead directly to Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in Rome in 800, creating a Western empire that claimed equal status with Byzantium. Two empires now existed where Byzantine theory insisted only one could be legitimate. Both claimed to be the true successor to Rome. Both claimed Christian authority. The iconoclasm controversy did not cause this division alone, but it accelerated and deepened fractures in the Christian world that would eventually produce the Great Schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, a division that persists into the present day. Back in Constantinople, iconoclasm's first phase ended in a way no one predicted. Constantine V died in 775, mourned by the soldiers who had fought his successful campaigns and viewed with considerably less affection by the monks he had persecuted. His immediate successors continued iconoclast policies, but with steadily diminishing enthusiasm and conviction. The fire was dying down. Then came Empress Irene, and everything changed again. Irene ruled as regent for her young son Constantine VI, and she decisively favored icon restoration. In 787, she convened the Second Council of Nicaea, recognized as the Seventh Ecumenical Council by both Eastern and Western churches. This council officially condemned iconoclasm and articulated the theological basis for icon veneration in terms that have guided Orthodox Christianity ever since. Icons, the council carefully declared, were legitimate objects of veneration but not worship. The honor shown to an image passed through it to its prototype, the holy person it depicted. Christ's incarnation sanctified material representation. The persecution of the previous decades had been a terrible error, a deviation from true Christian teaching. For a hopeful moment, it seemed the controversy might finally be over. The wounds could begin to heal. The exiled monks could return home. The icons could resume their places in churches and homes throughout the empire. But theological disputes rarely end so cleanly when political power remains involved. The 8th century gave way to the 9th, and Byzantine military fortunes shifted in disturbing ways. Arab forces defeated Byzantine armies in Asia Minor in 781. The Bulgars extracted humiliating tribute from Constantinople in 792. In the 820s, Arab raiders captured Crete, establishing a pirate base that would threaten Byzantine shipping for over a century. In 838, the great fortress of Amorium fell to Arab assault despite desperate Byzantine defense. Do you see the pattern emerging? Byzantine iconodule emperors were losing battles, to medieval minds absolutely convinced that God intervened directly in military affairs, rewarding the righteous and punishing the sinful. This demanded explanation. Perhaps the iconoclasts had been right after all. Perhaps abandoning their purifying reforms and returning to image veneration had brought divine disfavor down upon Byzantine armies. In 815, Emperor Leo V revived iconoclasm with renewed conviction. A council that year forbade icons once again, reinstituting the prohibitions that had been lifted less than 30 years earlier. The second iconoclastic period had begun, and those who had celebrated the restoration of icons found themselves once more facing imperial persecution. This second phase lasted 28 years, shorter than the first, and perhaps somewhat less brutal in its persecutions, but still marked by genuine suffering for defenders of icons. The familiar pattern repeated itself. Emperors enforced icon bans with varying degrees of severity. Monks and their supporters resisted with varying degrees of success. And theological arguments circled endlessly around the same fundamental questions about image, representation, and divine authority that had defined the controversy from its beginning. The final end came in 843. Emperor Theophilus, the last iconoclast emperor, died in 842 after a reign that had maintained the ban on icons with consistent conviction. His widow Theodora became regent for their young son Michael III. Like Irene more than half a century before her, Theodora personally favored icons and the monks who defended them. Unlike previous transitions between iconoclasm and icon veneration, this one would prove permanent. On March 11th, 843, Empress Theodora formally and definitively restored icon veneration throughout the Byzantine Empire. She managed this momentous restoration with remarkable diplomatic skill that previous emperors had lacked. The sources note with some surprise that the change produced no new rifts within the church or empire. An unusual achievement given how bitterly contentious the issue had been for over a century. Theodora somehow found a way to restore icons while not entirely condemning everyone who had supported iconoclasm, allowing the empire to move forward rather than tearing itself apart with recriminations. The first Sunday of Lent became the Feast of Orthodoxy, a celebration still observed in Eastern Christianity today, more than 1,100 years later. Every year, Orthodox Christians around the world commemorate the triumph of icon veneration over iconoclasm, celebrating those who defended sacred images against the full might of the Byzantine state. But what does this story actually mean? Why should anyone living in the modern world care about a medieval dispute over religious images painted on wood? Think carefully about what the iconoclasm controversy reveals about the nature and limits of power. Byzantine emperors possessed authority that modern leaders can barely imagine, let alone exercise. They commanded armies that could march from Spain to Persia. They controlled economies through regulations touching every guild and marketplace. They appointed religious leaders with the stroke of a pen. They defined imperial ideology and enforced it through networks of bureaucrats and informers. They claimed direct divine sanction for their rule, presenting themselves in elaborate ceremonies as God's chosen representatives on earth. The rituals of the Byzantine court deliberately and systematically blurred the line between earthly and heavenly authority. Yet 3 emperors over more than a century, backed by all this power, could not force their subjects to abandon painted images. Leo III, Constantine V, and Leo V each wielded the full force of the Byzantine state against icons. They destroyed countless artworks. They closed monasteries and scattered their inhabitants. They persecuted thousands of monks with public humiliations and private tortures. They exiled, imprisoned, and executed defenders of images. And in the end, they failed. Not because they lacked power in any conventional sense. They possessed power beyond what most rulers throughout history could dream of commanding. They failed because they confronted something that power alone cannot overcome: genuine belief. The monks who refused to abandon icons were not simply being stubborn or contrarian. They genuinely believed, at the deepest level of their being, that those images connected them to divine reality. They were willing to suffer exile, humiliation, torture, and death rather than betray that conviction. No amount of imperial force could reach into their souls and change what they knew to be true. This is the paradox that sees Caesaropapism, the Byzantine fusion of imperial and religious authority, could never resolve despite all its theoretical elegance and practical power. You can command bodies to march, to obey, to submit. You cannot command souls to believe something they know in their hearts to be false. You can destroy images made of wood and pigment. You cannot destroy the beliefs that give those images meaning. Consider how this pattern echoes and re-echoes through history, long after the Byzantine Empire crumbled into dust. The Taliban destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001, believing they were purifying Afghanistan of idolatry, just as Constantine V believed he was purifying Byzantium. The statues were obliterated, reduced to rubble by explosives and artillery. But Buddhism survived, and the destruction of those statues became not a triumph of ideological purity, but an enduring symbol of Taliban brutality that turned international opinion against the regime. Or think about contemporary debates over monuments and symbols that fill our news feeds and social media arguments. Statues are toppled in some cities and fiercely defended in others. Flags are banned by some authorities and waved defiantly by their supporters. Companies remove problematic imagery from products in response to public pressure. Schools rename buildings and sports teams reconsider mascots. Each of these modern conflicts involves the same fundamental question the Byzantine iconoclasts faced. Who controls what images mean? And what happens when official meaning clashes with popular belief? China's government restricts religious imagery and monitors places of worship, echoing the Caesaropapist impulse to control spiritual expression through state power. Yet underground churches flourish despite official disapproval, just as Byzantine monks continued venerating icons in secret even during the worst persecutions. The Byzantine iconoclasm controversy also reveals something profound about the relationship between military success and ideological legitimacy. Constantine V's iconoclasm flourished largely because he won battles. His subjects could look at their victorious emperor and conclude that God must favor his policies. When later Iconodule emperors lost wars, iconoclasm revived as people searched for explanations that made sense within their worldview. We still tend to interpret political success as validation of ideology, economic prosperity as proof of policy correctness. Perhaps most importantly, the iconoclasm story demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt that religious disputes are never only about religion. Leo III did not launch iconoclasm purely from disinterested theological conviction. He was influenced by Islam's strict prohibition of religious images, by political calculations about centralizing authority in his own hands, by the desire to assert imperial control over an increasingly independent church hierarchy. Constantine V's brutal assault on monasteries was as much about seizing land and breaking an alternative power structure as about abstract theology. The monks he persecuted controlled significant economic resources, educated elites who might challenge imperial authority, and networks of communication that operated independently of imperial bureaucracy. Similarly, the restoration of icons under Empresses Irene and Theodora cannot be separated from the gender dynamics of Byzantine politics. Both women ruled as regents for minor sons, positions that depended heavily on building and maintaining coalitions of support. Reversing iconoclasm allowed them to build powerful alliances with monastic communities who had suffered persecution, and with popular religious sentiment that had never stopped venerating icons in private, even when public veneration was banned. Theology and politics intertwined so thoroughly in the iconoclasm controversy that separating them becomes not merely difficult, but genuinely impossible. The Byzantine iconoclasm controversy transformed art, theology, and politics across an empire that lasted more than a millennium. It contributed directly to the growing division between Eastern and Western Christianity that persists to this day, more than 1,000 years later. It crystallized Orthodox theology and identity in ways that continue to define that tradition for hundreds of millions of believers. But perhaps its most enduring lesson is simpler and more universal. Images matter. They matter enough that people throughout history have killed and died over them. They matter enough that the most powerful rulers on earth, commanding armies and bureaucracies and all the instruments of state violence, cannot simply decree their meaning away. The meaning of images lives in human hearts, and hearts are the one thing even emperors cannot fully command. When a volcano erupted in the Aegean in 726, Emperor Leo III believed he saw divine judgment against idol worship. What he actually witnessed, though he could not have known it then, was the beginning of a conflict that would prove something far more important than any theological point about icons: the ultimate limits of imperial power when it confronts genuine belief. The icons survived. They hang today in Orthodox churches around the world, depicting Christ and the Virgin and saints in styles that would be recognizable to Byzantine worshippers of 12 centuries ago. The emperors who destroyed them are remembered primarily for that destruction, their military victories and administrative achievements overshadowed by their persecution of monks and burning of sacred images. And every year, on the first Sunday of Lent, Orthodox Christians gather in churches decorated with the very icons their spiritual ancestors defended with their freedom and their lives. They celebrate the triumph of orthodoxy, honoring those who refused to abandon sacred images against the full might of the Byzantine state. The war on images ended more than 1,100 years ago. The images won.